welcome to our live session on how you can become a Canadian permanent resident before, during, or after you complete your studies in Canada. My name is Kalisha. I practice immigration and family law in Canada. I'm located in Toronto, Ontario. And one of the reasons that we've decided to talk about this topic is because we get a lot of questions from persons on studying in Canada and also how they can become a permanent resident. So this topic is something that I've assisted many persons. Particular application is something that I've assisted many persons with. And I'm not only familiar with it in my from a professional point of view, but this is something that is also personal to me because I came to Canada as an international student. So I'm familiar with assisting clients, and I'm also familiar with this on a personal level. So I understand some of the questions that persons may have with regards to um, tuition fees, with regards to whether or not they can work in Canada when they study, what's the best province to study in, and what are the options that are available to them should they decide to stay in Canada after the completion of their studies. So there are many things that we would like to cover concerning, obtaining permanent residence in Canada. After you complete your studies. I wouldn't be able to go through everything in this session, but we will be having a part two of this particular topic in the near future. So stay connected with us so that you will be able to get information on that. So some of the things that persons often ask about, like I mentioned, is the tuition fees and working arrangements in Canada during their studies, whether or not they can bring their family here. Um, with regards to tuition fees, that is something that differs depending on the level of studies, whether you coming to Canada as an undergrad studies or you're coming as a postgraduate student. It depends on the province that you live in. And one of the things that I want to mention is that Canada is an in-demand location, as they say, for international students. It's one of the top 10 destinations for global international study. In 2019, there were over 400,000 study permits that were approved. So there are quite a lot of persons coming to Canada to study each year. Of course, that number decreased in 2020 because of COVID-19, but Canada is still processing applications for study permits. So of course, it took them some time to get adjusted, like every other country, to the pandemic. So that's the only reason why that number has decreased. But they're still processing study permit applications, and also students are allowed. There's been some changes which allows students to study in their home country, that is to study online, which was not accepted before the pandemic. So if you're interested in studying in Canada, but you're thinking, well, I can't do it now because of the pandemic, bear in mind that that is still possible, and the government is trying to make as much adjustments to accommodate international students. International students and migrants in general have contributed a lot to Canada, and there's so many examples that I can give of immigrants who would have contributed to this country. So that's the reason why the government is making, changes to accommodate persons who would like to complete their studies in Canada. So I will be taking some time at the end of the session to answer some questions. So if you have questions, please go ahead and submit those questions, and I will try my best to answer as much as I can. So as going back to some of the common questions that we get from persons. Like I said, one of them is the tuition fees. That varies depending on where you study, which province you decide to study in. If you choose, for example, to come to Ontario, that is one of the most populated provinces. So, of course, tuition fees in Ontario would be higher. But there are other provinces that you can consider, for example, Prince Edward Islands, Newfoundland. So options are there for affordable studies. Um, Tuition, like I said, varies depending on your level of study. So, if you're coming for undergraduate studies, it's going to be a bit more expensive than graduate studies. For graduate studies, for example, you can find schools that with tuition fees as low as $4,000. But for undergraduate studies, most times the lowest that you will see is around $12,000. There are a few schools that offer where their tuition fee is under $10,000, but generally you would see fees around 12,000 and up if you're coming as an undergraduate student. The other question that we get a lot with regards to studying in Canada is whether or not you can work during your studies. You are allowed to work. If you're bringing, let's say you're married and you're coming here with your spouse and your children, your spouse is also able to work. Your spouse gets a work permit, and your children are also able to attend school while you are studying in Canada. You are allowed to work off campus a maximum of 20 hours, but you must be a full-time student. And during the break, let's say the semester break, for example, during the summer, you are allowed to work full-time off campus, off campus, and you can work on campus during your studies too. So one of the other questions that we get a lot from students is what are the options available for them to stay in Canada after they complete their studies? Now, there are several options that are available. Some of two of the programs rather that would be more applicable to persons who are international students in Canada is the Express Entry Program. That's the first one. And also the Provincial Nominee Program. The Provincial Nominee is sort of a subcategory. It's under the Express Entry Program, but it does operate separately. So you can apply to the Provincial Nominee Program if you're if you're a candidate in the Express Entry pool, or you can apply directly to a province to obtain permanent residence in that province. I know some of what I'm saying, you may not be familiar with some of the terms, but I try to explain those as we go along in the live. And like I said, if you have questions, please feel free to submit those questions, and I will try my best to answer as many questions as I can. So just to jump into the programs, the options that are available for you to study in Canada, for you to remain in Canada after you would have, during or after you would have completed your studies. I'd first like to start with, as I mentioned, the Express Entry Program. So the Express Entry Program is a points-based program where you're given points for several factors, including your age, including your work experience, your level of education. If you have a spouse, a common law spouse, or you're married, you can also get points from that spouse, and they get points also based on their age, work experience, their level of education. There are several other factors that are included. Those are the main ones. And there is an English test that is required, that is mandatory for everyone applying for permanent residence in Canada through any of the economic streams. So that is generally a requirement. It's a must. You have to complete that test. So first off, the Express Entry Program has there are three different categories In the express entry program, there is the federal skilled worker program, there's the federal skills trade program, and there's the Canadian experience class. And I'll explain a bit later how studying in Canada is connected to these programs. So these programs they're a bit different. For example, for the federal skilled worker program, let's say you come to Canada as a student and you haven't completed your studies as yet, you can apply to this program based on your work experience outside of Canada. So if you have work experience for at least 1 year within the past 10 years, you may be eligible for this stream. So you're able to apply to this federal skilled worker program while you are studying. And of course, this program is also available to persons outside of Canada. But in some countries, they do not have the testing centers that offer the English language tests. So those persons would have to, travel to another country to complete the test. Or, if you're in Canada, you're able to overcome that hurdle and write the test here to be able to apply to that program. So, for example, I know for Guyana, there isn't any testing center in Guyana. So persons who are coming to study in Canada from Guyana, you would have to either, go to Trinidad, which is nearby, to write that test. Or, if you come to Canada as a student, you write the test here and you're able to apply to this program before you complete your studies because it's based on your work experience outside of Canada. The second program in this stream is in the express entry stream is the federal skilled trades program. So this program is different from the federal skilled worker program in that, and I'm speaking in lay terms here, the federal skills trades program is more for persons who have hands-on work experience. So plumbers, electricians, if you're a chef, that is more suitable for persons with that kind of work experience. The federal skilled worker program is more suitable for persons who have experience in a managerial position or something that requires at least a university diploma or degree for you to work. So there's something called a knock code that is used to classify the different occupations. But of course, I wouldn't have enough time to get into that tonight, but I definitely will speak about it in a future session. The third category is the Canadian experience class. And unlike the other two, this is also a points-based stream, but you're only able to apply to this particular one if you have Canadian work experience. So you need at least 1 year work experience in order to apply to this stream. So for international students, most of them will be attracted to this. And the reason why is because you are required generally if you're applying for permanent residence for the under the economic programs, you're required to have at least 1 year. If you are applying under the Canadian experience class, then you're not required to show that proof of funds. And the reason for that is because the government feels that you've had at least 1 year Canadian work experience. So it would be easier for you to find a job. You've lived in Canada, you're familiar with how things work. So it would be much easier for you to integrate and be employed. So for persons who may not be able to show the funds, and it usually increases, by just a little bit every year. Right now, it's a little over $12,000. So, for example, if you're applying under the federal skills worker program, you'd have to show that you have at least that amount in your bank account, and that has to remain there while your application is being processed until the processing is complete, and the officer has to be, the officer has to be convinced that this is your funds that you're using. So if you come to Canada as a student and you work during your studies, there are some exceptions to that though, or you work after you completed your studies here, then you can work, let's say, 1 year after you would have completed your studies and then apply to the Canadian Experience class. So you don't have to show that proof of funds, because I understand that, coming to Canada as an international student is expensive. Tuition fees might be a lot for you. So you may not, you might not be in a position where you have, over 12,000, 12 to $13,000 saved, to show. So the Canadian Experience class is attractive to most persons who are looking to obtain permanent residence in Canada after they would have completed their studies. With the Canadian work experience, after you would have completed your studies, you get something that's called with a Canadian Experience class, you get, in order to be eligible, like I said, you have to work for 1 year, at least 1 year. So you can work part-time or full-time, but the amount of hours, it must amount to at least 1 year work experience. So some persons may not get that 1 year. They may not get a full-time job. During the first year after they graduated, they would have been working part-time. So they'll be able to work 2 years and then, use the 2 years experience as the part-time experience to apply to this stream. What is important to note is that once you would have studied in Canada, and you complete your studies, and the university would have issued you a letter stating that you met all the requirements to complete the program, then you're able to apply for what is called a postgraduate work permit. That is a one-time work permit. You only get that work permit one time, and it's given only to, the postgraduate work permit is given only to international students who would have completed at least 8 months study in Canada. So that permit is an open work permit. It's not tied to any employer, or it's not tied to any occupation. Of course, like, with everything, there are exceptions. But normally persons don't get an open work permit. Most times, if you're applying for a work permit in Canada, you have to work with a specific employer, and you have to obtain something what is called a labor market impact assessment. And basically, that is, your employer would have had to prove that they tried to retain or hire a Canadian citizen or permanent resident for this job, and no, they couldn't find someone. So that is the reason they're hiring a temporary resident or somebody outside of Canada. But with this postgraduate work permit that you get after you would have completed your studies, you do not need a labor market impact assessment. It's an open work permit. And that permit is usually tied to the length of your studies. The maximum amount of time you get is 3 years. So it can be anywhere between 1 to 3 years. And when you're not allowed to extend that permit when it expires. So that is something that a lot of international students are interested in. And I advise persons that, even during your studies, if you intend to apply for permanent residence here, then you want to do a lot of networking and see how soon you can get a job after you complete your studies. But like I mentioned also, there are some exceptions which allows you to use work experience that you obtained during your studies. Again, if you're interested in applying to the Canadian Experience class. So that is the summary for the Express Entry program. And as I mentioned, there are several factors that they consider in order to determine the points that you get for these programs. So how the programs work, these three programs that I've just spoken about, there are a number of people that apply to the Express Entry they call it a pool. So there are a number of people that are in that pool. So what you do, you submit what is called a profile, and you're entered into this pool with everyone else who's created a profile. And every month they do a draw, and there's a cutoff point. Um, there's a certain cutoff point. So it usually the cutoff point is somewhere around, like, 400, and just the high 400s generally. That's where the cutoff point is. So anyone who's under that would not be invited to apply for a permanent residence. So if you have points, you're able to see your points, right? And if your points are within that cutoff range, then you get what is called an invitation to apply for permanent residence, and at that point you submit your permanent resident application. So the other option, as I mentioned in the beginning, that you're able to apply to for permanent residence is the provincial nominee program. So every province in Ontario, in Canada, sorry, has provincial nominee program. And what is good is that every province has a program that is specifically tailored towards international students, towards keeping international students in that province. So the provincial nominee program differs from province to province. And it's basically, it depends on the needs of the province. So if, for example, there is a labor shortage in a particular occupation, let's say, persons, with IT skills in that province, then that province will will tailor a program to attract persons with those skills to the province. So if you're an international student, and let's say you've come and you're during your studies, you're studying, but you have experience from your home country in that particular occupation that is in demand in that province, then you can apply to the provincial nominee program. How this program also works is that, let's say, remember I spoke earlier about creating a profile and entering into a pool. So let's say, for example, you are in the pool with everyone else, and a province is able to actually select you to apply for permanent residence. And of course, as I mentioned, some of these options are available out if you're outside of Canada, but there may be some difficulties in applying to these programs if you're outside of Canada. So if you're in that pool, then the province is able to select you if they see, well, this is a candidate that has, that will be able to contribute to our province, and that has the is qualified in the occupation that we are looking for, then they invite you to apply. So what happens when you get that invitation from the province? It actually increases the number of points that you get, your overall points. So let's say, for example, you've entered a pool, but you only have maybe, you know 300 points, right? Remember I said that generally the cutoff point is in the high 400s. So let's say you have just 300 points in the pool, but then you get invited by a province to apply for permanent residence. So you get an additional like 600 points. So, you know, more than likely with that amount, with an additional 600 points, you'd get an invitation to apply for permanent residence, um, which, works in your favor. So every province, as I mentioned, has its own program. So, for example, Ontario has a program that's there. There are three different programs that are available to international students. There's the international student stream. There's also a stream for students who have completed their masters in Ontario. There's a stream for students who would have completed their PhD in Ontario. And there's slight differences in the program. So, for example, if you're applying to the PhD stream, Ontario has a program whereby you'd have to show generally that you have a job offer. So remember, this is different from the express entry program, which you can apply to, especially the Canadian experience class. But if you want to apply, let's say, directly to a province, so you want to apply to the province of Ontario, you'd have to apply to, you know, through one of these streams, depending on the level of study you would have completed in Ontario. So, for example, if you are applying to and there's a bit of a difference. So, for example, if you're applying to the PhD stream, you wouldn't be required to show that you have a job offer. If you're applying to the other streams, you'd have to show that you have a job offer. So there's slight differences in the provinces, and slight differences in the programs that are available in each province. Of course, I'm not going to go in that much detail. It's because I'm just going to try to give you overview of what is actually available in Canada and in every province. But again, we'll definitely discuss this in another live session. So British Columbia, another province in Canada, so they have four different options that are available to international students. So as I mentioned earlier, there are programs that are available in every province that is tailored towards attracting international students and retaining international students in that province, because there are certain shortages in different areas, and the provinces are looking to attract qualified persons who can meet the needs and also contribute to that province. So there are four different options that are available in British Columbia. In Alberta, there's the Alberta Opportunity Stream that is available for international students. There's also one stream that's available in Manitoba. And as I mentioned, if the tuition fee is an issue for you, might want to consider going to Alberta or Manitoba or Newfoundland or Prince Edward's Island to study, because tuition in those provinces are a bit cheaper, much cheaper actually, than what you would pay in Ontario. Most persons want to come to Ontario or British Columbia, 'cause they're most populated provinces. So most persons, would like to go to that province. But again, if tuition is an issue, then you'd want to consider living in one of the other provinces that is not as much populated. In Saskatchewan, there's also a stream that's available for international students there. In Nova Scotia, there are three options that are available for international students in that province. In New Brunswick, there's one stream that is available. In Prince Edward's Island, there's also the International Graduate Stream. And in Newfoundland, there are two streams that are available for you to study. Bear in mind that there are changes to these programs quite often. So you'd want to keep updated as to what the changes are, because as I mentioned, oftentimes it's based on the occupation that's in demand. So let's say, for example, there's a demand for nurses now in Newfoundland, but then persons would make use of that opportunity and apply to that program. So then, within a certain amount of time, that particular occupation may no longer be, something that a province is looking to attract persons for. Not that you can't apply to, if you're a nurse, you can apply to the express entry program, as I mentioned, but, they may have a need for for a different occupation. The province of Quebec also, they have two streams that are available. Quebec operate their immigration programs are slightly different from the other provinces. So I will discuss that, as I mentioned, in future live session. So Canada has a lot of options if you want to come here to study. They every year, we have hundreds of thousands of international students that come here every year. Also, there are hundreds of thousands of international students who um, obtain a work permit and obtain permanent residence in Canada. One of the things that you want to bear in mind when you're applying to study in Canada is that you want to ensure that you're applying to what is called a designated learning institution, because that is very important your to the postgraduate work permit. As I mentioned earlier, the postgraduate work permit allows you to get Canadian experience. So after you would have studied, so you can apply to the Canadian experience class, and you wouldn't have that issue of having to show the proof of funds. But in order to get that postgraduate work permit, your studies would have had to have been at a designated learning institution. And a designated learning institution is an institution that is approved by the province to provide post-secondary studies. So each institution has a unique number. You can research that on the government website, or you can always reach out to me if you have questions. So one of the issues that I deal with sometimes with clients is that they would have applied to a school to study, but then after completing their studies, they found out that they're not eligible for a postgraduate work permit. And that is because they came initially to Canada to study at a particular school. They changed, which you're allowed to do. You're allowed to change, the university or college, but then they went to study at a school that is not a designated learning institution, and after graduating, only to find out that they're not eligible for a postgraduate work permit. So I like to mention that often, because it's a very sad situation, or place to be in, after you would have spent so much money, invested it so much money and time in your studies, only to find out that you're not eligible for the postgraduate work permit. So you want to bear that in mind. You want to ensure that even from the beginning, that when you're submitting your application, that there's certain things that the officer who's reviewing your application looks for. I would get into detail in that in another session, but just as I mentioned, just to give you some general information, you want to ensure that application is completed properly. You want to ensure that even though you may intend to reside in Canada after your studies, that the officer wants to see that that after your studies, it's something called like dual intent, that you would go back to your country. So they look to see that you have ties to your home country. I know that might be sounding a bit confusing for some of you, because I'm saying that you can apply for permanent residence, but then this is what the officer is looking for. Because of course there's while the programs are there for you to obtain permanent residence, there are of course exceptions. So for example, if you're someone that, if you completed your application, your study permit application, and you weren't truthful, you weren't honest in that application, then something like misrepresentation may come up, which of course, when you submit, the may not be picked up by the immigration, may not notice that immediately, but then when you submit another application, then they find out, well, oh, you weren't honest in your initial application. So then of course, your chances of getting a work permit, you may not get that work permit. Of course, you can get legal help in trying to resolve that, if it was like a genuine mistake or something, oversight on your part. But they want to ensure that, let's say that happens, you're not going to say, well, I'm going to stay in Canada, right, and not go home, right? So they look to see if you have sufficient ties to your country, if that upon the completion of your studies, that you'd be willing to leave, or if something like that arises, that you'd be willing to go back home. So it's really important that you present enough information that would satisfy the officer of that. So they look to see your that your intent to study is genuine. Of course, they look for proof of funds. So as I mentioned, tuition fee varies from province to province. I usually advise persons to pay, if they can, at least the first year's tuition, but make some payment towards your tuition fees before you apply for your study permit. You want to make some payment to show that you're coming genuinely to study and you're committed to studying. So they look for proof of funds. They look to see, of course, whether or not you will be able to support yourself when you're in Canada. Generally for 1 year, they your on average, like your living expenses would come up to probably about $10,000. If you're coming with a spouse and children, of course, you'd have to show a little bit more for, if you have a spouse or you have a child that you're coming to Canada, that is coming to Canada with you. So those are some of the general things that you'd want to bear in mind when you're applying to come to Canada. So I will try to answer some of the questions that you've been asking, and there's quite a few questions. I wouldn't be able to answer all those questions. So the first one is, can my spouse and two children under 5 travel with me? Yes. As I mentioned, if you're coming to Canada to study, your spouse and children, they can come with you, common law spouse, or if you're married, and your spouse would also get a work permit. And depending on where your children are going to school, they may not need a study permit for if they're young children. So someone is asking if their children are on the 5, so they wouldn't be going to a post-secondary school, so they would not need a study permit, but they're allowed to come with you. They're allowed to study, and your spouses can apply for a work permit to work while you're studying full-time in Canada. So the another question is with regard to some of the changes because of COVID-19, and that is you know if you would qualify for a postgraduate work permit if you're studying online. The answer to that is yes, but that was not the case prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. But, you know, persons were approved to travel to Canada, but the airports were closed, so they couldn't travel. So the government has made an exception to allow you to study online, to allow you to stay, you stay in your home country and you study online, and that your online studies, that time will count towards your postgraduate work permit. So as I explained earlier, your postgraduate work permit is tied to the length of your studies. So you have to study for at least 8 months. So if your studies is under 8 months, then you wouldn't get a postgraduate work permit. So if you're not able to travel to Canada at this time, and you have to start your studies, you're allowed to do that online, and that time will count towards your postgraduate work permit. However, this policy can change at any time because this is an exception that is being made because of COVID-19. They're allowing international students to come into Canada. You do need to show, of course, that your school that you have a negative COVID-19 test, and you are required to show that your school has a plan, a COVID-19 plan. So most of the schools have gotten that plan in place, and some of them are still working on it. But that's something that you would have to show, that your school has a COVID-19 plan. Yes, the recording will be available later. The other question is about the federal skill program and if it's available to persons in Trinidad. So the express entry program is available to anyone regardless of where you're living. So it is available to persons in Trinidad. As I mentioned, you would have to complete that English language test, and the good thing is that there are testing centers in Trinidad where you can take that test. I know there Guyana doesn't have testing centers, and that is a question that I get. So for persons in Guyana, maybe have to travel to Trinidad to take that test, or you can come here, start your studies, and then take the test once you arrive in Canada. If you're not eligible for one of the three options under the express entry um, stream, then you can look into applying to the provincial nominee program. So again, the provincial nominee program is based on your occupation and generally whether or not that occupation is in demand, but also there is a specific they all the provinces have a specific program for international students who would have studied in that province. So before you come and you're looking to decide which province you want to live in, of course, depending on you look at the cost of living in that province, but you'd also want to look to see what options they have available for you based on your personal circumstances, and if that is something that would work to your benefit. So you take all of that into consideration when you're deciding which province to study in. So we will be sending out some information within the next few days about some of the things that I discussed in the live. As someone is asking about obtaining a work permit, as I mentioned, that generally if you're a temporary resident or outside of Canada, you're a foreign national outside of Canada, then your employer, you need to have a valid job offer, and that employer needs to obtain what is called a labor market impact assessment, LMIA for short, showing that they've tried to hire a Canadian permanent resident or citizen. They weren't able to get someone to fill that position. That's a Canadian permanent resident or citizen, sorry. So they're hiring a foreign national. So and of course, the employer has to pay a fee to obtain that labor market impact assessment. However, if you come to Canada, you are allowed to study. To work, if you come to Canada to study, you are allowed to work. There is a limitation on you work a maximum of 20 hours off campus per week. But after you complete your studies, you get a postgraduate work permit, for which you don't need a labor market impact assessment, and you can work with any employer generally. There are a few limited, restrictions, exceptions to that. So with regards to scholarships, there are several scholarships available. There's scholarships available through the government, depending on the country that you're coming from. There's a scholarship available for CARICOM nationals, but there are also scholarships available from the school. So you'd want to look at a school. We'll be sending out some information on scholarships, and if you've registered for the event and we have your email address, we'll be sending out some information on scholarships and where to look for scholarships. If you're coming to Canada as a postgraduate for postgraduate studies, if you're coming to do a master's or a PhD, there are a lot of grants that are available for you to study. So that is something that you'd want to definitely look into if you're looking to come here for postgraduate studies. So if you have a pending application and you want to know whether or not your spouse can apply for a different immigration program, I'm suggesting that you contact us, because of course that is not something that we can answer without knowing your personal circumstances and the factors that are involved. professions that are in demand, again, like I mentioned, depends on the province that you're going to. So there are provinces right now where there's a demand for nurses, and there's a demand for people in the medical field. There are other provinces that have a demand for persons in with IT skills. There's some provinces that often have a demand for persons who would generally qualify under the federal skills trades program, which I know it's a lot of information tonight, but which I mentioned earlier is more, that's more for persons with hands-on, hands-on work experience. So electricians, plumbers, mechanics. So that depends on the province. So that varies from province to province. So the another question is whether or not the English test is connected to the study permit. No, the English test that I'm speaking about is the English test that is required for you to apply to any economic immigration program in Canada. So if you're applying to an economic program, immigration program, and the English language test is required, even if English is the country is the official language of your country of origin. It is still a requirement. It is not connect. You don't have to do that to get a study permit. You have to do that if you're applying for permanent residence through the economic streams. However, there are schools that do have a language test, but again, that would depend on the country that you're coming from and the program that you're applying to. Especially if it's an undergraduate program, there are some schools that have a requirement for you to do a language test, but that is not the test that I was referring to. And since I'm talking about that, you want to be careful because you want to ensure that you complete the right test. So the testing centers that offer the English test, they have a test for they have an academic test and they have the immigration test. So some persons, write the wrong test. So that's something that you want to bear in mind if you're looking to write the test for immigration purposes. You want to ensure that you pay for the right test. The test costs just over $300, and the two places that offer them, they're called, it's either the IELTS test or the CELPIP test. They're two different agencies that offer them, and it's just over 300 Canadian dollars for that test. So again, with regards to working in Canada, as I mentioned earlier, you are allowed to work whether you're doing whether you're postgraduate or whether you're undergraduate or graduate student. You can work, sorry, while you're studying. If you're working on campus, off campus, your hours of work, it's restricted to 20 hours. Yes, your spouse is allowed to accompany you if you're coming to Canada as a student. You do need to apply for a study permit even if you're studying online. In the past, you didn't require a study permit if the length of your program was less than 6 months, but that is a requirement now only because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that may change back within the near future. That I wouldn't be able to say when the government would change that, when or if they would change that policy. But in the past, it wasn't required if you're studying for less than 6 months, but it's now a requirement that you get a study permit even if your studies is less than 6 months. So I've already explained and given a brief overview of the programs that are available for permanent residents. The live will be available for you to watch. It will be recorded, so it will be available for you to watch. So you can go back and look at it. And you can always connect with us to if you have questions about anything that I would have mentioned tonight, if you have a pending application and you have questions that you did, you can always go back to that, you can always contact us, sorry. So I believe I've answered most of the questions. Someone is asking about marine postgraduate programs. I'm not sure what you're referring to. If you're referring to, there's an institute in the province of Newfoundland. I'm not sure if you are referring to that. With regards to processing time of the study permit application differs depending on the country that you're applying from. Of course, bear in mind that there are delays because of COVID-19. Applications are still being processed, but it's not as fast as it was being processed in the past. And I generally encourage people to apply at least, apply way in advance before your studies are scheduled to commence. With regards to age limit, so that is a good question. There, if you're speaking about the express entry program, there is of course age limit. So, well, they don't say that you can't apply if you're over a certain age. So let me correct that. But you get more points depending on if you're within a certain age range. So generally, if you're over, your points decrease every year, right? So every birth anniversary, the number of points that you get for your age decreases. So if you are, like when you're 35, once you've hit 35, your points start decreasing more. When you hit 40, then you get less points. And of course, sorry, well, I shouldn't say of course, but at 45, um, you wouldn't get points for your age. So the younger you are, the more points that you would get in the express entry, pool. But it's not a case that you cannot apply. And for persons who are in Canada, I usually say to persons that it doesn't hurt to submit a profile. And a good example is the last draw. As I mentioned earlier in the live, there's a draw that is done every month for persons in the express entry pool, and they usually the cut off point is in the high 400s. So let's say 400 and 70s, they usually cut it off. So anybody that's below that would not be invited to apply for permanent residence. We've had a historic draw, and the cutoff point was 75, which is, it's never happened before. So for persons who had Canadian work experience, the cutoff point was 75. So there were a lot of people in that pool that would not have been invited to apply, but they submitted a profile nonetheless. And thankfully they now have the chance to become a permanent resident. So it doesn't hurt to submit a profile to enter in the express entry pool, even if you're 40 or over 45. But again, if you're 40 or 45, and you can always explore the provincial nominee programs. Yes, so you do, as I mentioned, you do lose points at every um birth anniversary. You do lose points every year. So for some persons, I say to them, if I believe that they're more likely to get, it's likely that they will be invited to apply, I tell them, the earlier you apply, the better. It's not something that you should sit on or delay. So the questions that I'm seeing, I've answered most of those questions earlier. So you can always go back and watch this recording, and you'll get the answers to those questions. So as I've mentioned, if you have a pending application, or there's some question that you have about something I said tonight, or you want more information on on this particular topic, how you can become a Canadian permanent resident either during or after you complete your studies in Canada, you can always reach out to me. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram. Our social media handle is KYL Law Firm, or you can also connect with us on WhatsApp, and our the number is 647-749-7472. I definitely look out to interacting with some of you, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, is that I'm not only doing this in my profession as an immigration lawyer, but I came to Canada as an international student, so I understand this process from a personal level, and I understand a lot of the questions that people may have. So I definitely look out to receiving your questions. So this is the end of our live session. Please stay connected with us on social media, because we will be discussing and going more into detail into some of the things that I've mentioned tonight. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for registering, and I will see you in at the next live session. Good night.